Hi, everybody. Welcome to CMC. I'm Carol Looper. I'm a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and I was told today I should not call myself a retired reporter or a retired journalist. I should just call myself a journalist. So be it. It's great to see everybody today. Today's forum, Leadership Legacy, Kathryn Sullivan, is brought to us with support from WCBE and Battelle, and in partnership with the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, each represented here by many of their friends and associates. Please help me thank them. Now let's give a warm welcome to Amy Kennedy, Vice President for Education, STEM Learning, and Philanthropy at Battelle, who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone. As Carol mentioned, my name's Amy Kennedy. I work at Battelle. At Battelle, we work to solve the world's biggest problems wherever they are, from the ocean floor to outer space. And I'm pleased to introduce someone who does the same. Dr. Kathryn Sullivan studied earth sciences and geology as a university student. She later established herself as a leading oceanographer in the U.S. Naval Reserve, studying the ocean floors of the Atlantic and the Pacific. And then she decided to go up, way, way up. As an astronaut, she spent 22 total days in space. So no matter where you've been, where you are, or where you're going, she probably knows more about it than you do. Federally, she serves in NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In our backyard, almost literally, she's served as president and CEO of COSI, as well as director for OSU's Battelle Center for Mathematics and Science Education Policy. Students of Ohio and the nation are better off thanks to her work. I'll close with comments about Kathy borrowing words from Ohio's own John Glenn. Kathy's not just an ivory tower scientist. She was part of NASA's first class of female astronauts and went on to fly 3 shuttle missions. She is the first American woman to walk in space and served aboard the mission that deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. That role in helping humanity look outward has not prevented her from looking homeward. The planet is suffering increasingly severe upheavals, at least partly a result of climate change. Droughts, floods, typhoons, tornadoes. I believe my good friend Kathy is the right person for the right job at the right time. Welcome Kathy Sullivan to the podium. Dr. Sullivan is going to provide opening remarks and then sit down with Dr. Annalise Corbin, President and CEO of the PASS Foundation, for our conversation. Annalise is a personal friend and mentor of mine who has had her own amazing adventures underwater and exemplifies the phrase, find your way or make one. As an example, I would like you to ask her about commanding a crane from 2 states away to lift a massive water tank through the ceiling of her new building. Ladies and gentlemen, if there were ever a day to use the hashtag Women in STEM on your Twitter comments, today is the day. Kathy, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Amy. Well, thank you, Amy, and I can't tell you how delighted I am to be up here and see so many familiar faces and this wonderful familiar view again after almost 6 years commuting back and forth to Washington, D.C. What I want to do with my opening remarks is tell you a little bit about what I have been up to during those 6 years, and NOAA, as we call it, because none of us can say National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration 3 times fast. So that NOAA will do. It's without the H, NOAA, not that NOAA. So I'll tell you just a little bit about what we do, what some of the challenges and delights and rewards of my last several years have been. And from that perspective of earth sciences and science and technology policy, leave on your radar screen a couple of what I will argue will be big moving trends that we will all should and will find ourselves watching, dealing with, living with in the decade ahead. Many of you have asked in the little bit of visiting beforehand what's next, and I'm going to have proposed to Annalise that we let that be sort of part of the the conversational phase of this. So what is NOAA? What is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration? It's one of the country's oldest science agencies. It's a science-based services agency. And you all know NOAA. You may not, it suffers a bit from the holding company syndrome. You may not know NOAA as NOAA, but you touch NOAA every time you check your weather forecast, because satellite data are the bulk data that make every and any weather forecast possible, and NOAA runs the United States operational weather satellites. Whether you get that on your smartphone or your newspaper or your TV, the data, the models, the science originates and is really done by NOAA and then put out through those services. The earliest piece of NOAA goes back to Thomas Jefferson, 1807. When he founded the Survey of the Coast. We were a young maritime country. Coastwise transport for commerce and security was critical, and there were no charts for sailors and navigators to work by. So he established a service to go make those nautical charts, and NOAA to this day makes all the nautical charts for all United States waters. So if you're a boater, if you sail in Lake Erie, you're touching NOAA. If you go up to Lake Erie and want to know if it's going to be windy or calm or what life's going to be like on the islands offshore, and you dial up a weather buoy, you're touching NOAA. Those are NOAA buoys. If you have anything to do with Sea Grant, Sea Grant's a part of NOAA. If you measure your lot, or a surveyor comes out to measure your lot, he's relying on NOAA because that survey needs a frame of reference. It needs an XY point to start measuring from. The United States has a standard reference framework that all of our streets are aligned to. It's called the Geodetic Reference Framework, and NOAA maintains that Geodetic Reference Framework. So we have 5 different operating units. The National Weather Service is an operating unit of NOAA. The National Marine Fisheries Service, the National Ocean Service, which does the nautical charting and runs the country's underwater marine parks, if you will, the National Marine Sanctuaries. Ever go up to northern Michigan and stop in at Alpena, you'll see the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. Great set of shipwrecks offshore there. If you've not been, you need to get your robots up there. A body of oceanic and atmospheric research, because to continue to improve weather models, for example, and get longer and more accurate weather forecasts, you actually have to study not just weather, but the entire interconnected set of systems that make our planet function. If we just tried studying weather and made measurements now to predict what tomorrow would be, we could probably give you a weather forecast out to maybe 48 hours. You can get pretty useful guidance nowadays in a 5 to 7 and even 10-day weather forecast. Why is that? It's because we also study the longer-term variations of the Earth, which are the variations called climate. Climate is actually not an evil word. It just means the patterns of weather on timescales longer than 2 weeks. That's all that climate is. Seriously, that's all that climate is. We all know there are variations on longer than 2 week scales, right? They're called summer, winter, spring, and fall. So that's all it is. And if you want 10 or 20-day forecasts, if you think you ever want to be able to get to where you can make a seasonal forecast at the end of January for what detailed conditions will be in the summer, you have to be adding the longer-term climate factors in, like El Nino and other fundamental heartbeats of the planet. So NOAA does some of the research that contributes to all of that. I think the simple way to understand what NOAA means to us as Americans is that it's basically America's environmental intelligence agency. And all the constituent pieces that are NOAA, which were all assembled into one agency in 1970 by President Richard Nixon, all those pieces had at their origin the intention of protecting life and property and enabling a vibrant economy. So it was the Coast and Geodetic Survey to enable safe national security and safe coastwise commerce. It was the Weather Bureau, which originated back in the time of the settlement of the prairies, when telegraphs were just making the collection of data possible, and that was all about giving farmers and ranchers warning of weather that could damage their crops or kill them or harm their livestock. It was the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, back when the challenge with fisheries was not that they're being fished into the ground, but that there was abundance in United States waters and we should take advantage of our own abundance and gain some independence. So NOAA from its origins has been about understanding the Earth so that that understanding can be turned to practical purpose to protect lives and livelihoods and enable a vibrant economy. And that, in my view, is why it rightly belongs in the Department of Commerce. The other pieces of the Department of Commerce are mainly similar. They're all about the data and information that help our economy thrive. The Bureau of Standards is a part of the Department of Commerce. The Census Bureau is part of the Department of Commerce, Patent and Trademark, and NOAA. So the data and information that create us a vibrant level playing field for entrepreneurialism, for business, for innovation, that's 90, in fact, NOAA is 60% of the Department of Commerce's budget, and the other pieces are about 90%. So that's really the way to think about the Department of Commerce and our government. It's not at all just trade promotion. It's the enabling functions that let us have a healthy and vibrant economy. So in size, NOAA's right around 20,000 people. Budget just a tad shy of $6 billion. We are everywhere. We're in every state. We're in all the U.S. trust territories. I actually had a fisheries deputy assistant secretary in Brussels to work with the European Union, and in Tokyo to work with the Japanese and the Asian fleets. And we just got to do a lot of super fun things through the course of my 5 years there. One of the most interesting highlights to me was very early, about a year after President Obama opened the démarche to Cuba to shift relationships back to diplomatic footing. I went down to sign a memorandum of understanding with counterpart agencies in Cuba about marine protected areas and safety of navigation in the waters that link Mexico and the United States and Cuba. And I discovered from the then ambassador nominee that piece of paper we signed, as it turns out, is the first formal instrument signed between the governments of the United States and Cuba since the embargo. And it was really quite significant to know that I was getting to affix my signature on that little piece of work. We launched 3 satellites during my tenure, one to measure ocean waves and wind conditions, which are, again, critical to understanding how the ocean is affecting weather and climate. One that we launched out to 1 million miles away from the Earth, straight on the line to the sun, 1 million miles away. That's 1% of the distance to the sun. And it's basically the weather buoy that tells us when the sun has had these big eruptions of matter and mass that can wreak havoc with our magnetic field and knock out GPS satellites and trigger big currents in long-distance transmission lines that can short out transformers. It's like a weather buoy that warns us that one of those blasts is coming to Earth and creates enough minutes of warning lead time that utilities and satellite operators can take some precautionary measures. NOAA also does those space weather forecasts for the civilian sector. And just in early December, we launched the country's newest geostationary weather satellite. Google GOES 16, GOES-16 images. Factor of 4 greater resolution, 5 times the update rate. So in terms of really revolutionizing our ability to monitor and forecast severe weather like thunderstorm outbreaks and tornadoes. This is like jumping from black and white to full color high-def TV in one go, if you're in the weather business. So what are the things that I would urge you to keep on your radar screen? Water is going to be the issue of our times in the next 10 to 20 years on every scale, from local to regional to national and international. 34 states in the United States are fighting with each other over water right now, plus what you hear about in California. But 34 states right now, more countries than you can count. The Vatican is convening a major meeting this coming March about water on World Water Day to try to elevate the dialogue and spur greater action among countries to advance the science and the data and the knowledge. So we have some foresight. We can give governments and public officials and companies some foresight about what conditions to prepare for and how to manage them. Ocean issues are going to continue to evolve and increasingly have impacts that we all see and feel. The water of the ocean is becoming more acidic. That's just plain measurement. Go dip a stick in it over and over again. It's that ugly measurement like your doctor telling you your cholesterol is going up. No one wants to hear it, but it just is. If you're an oyster farmer, you care. You can't grow oysters in acidic water. Shells aren't stable in acidic water. They will dissolve. So that's a multi-million, tens of millions of dollar problem for the west coast of the United States and Alaska. It's a billions of dollar problem. Globally, it's a worse problem because the critters that make up the bottom of the global food chain are calcium-shelled animals that everything else above them, up to including us, basically feeds off of. So more acidic ocean has the risk of really debilitating the foundation of the ocean food chain, and that in turn can play a significant role in destabilizing global food security. 20% of the world's population depends critically on protein from the sea for their diet. So if we mess up the ocean, we're going to have a 20% of humanity food security problem. And finally, on the weather and climate front, the statistics of weather are changing. The number of rainy days, how intense rain is, how many extreme events of either heat or cold. Look anywhere in the world, the number of hot days in any region is going up. The nighttime low temperatures are also rising. The statistics are changing. That is the signature of our climate changing. Governments largely are responding to this. Some governments are struggling to decide how to respond to it. But to me, one of the hallmarks is, how real or not is this? 90 of the world's top insurers that collectively hold some $14 trillion of assets under insurance, about 2/3 of the global dollar value underwritten. 90 of them have banded together voluntarily in something called the Geneva Association to accelerate the science and accelerate the statistics and improve their ability to model the new risks. They know they can no longer assess their risk by looking at what the statistics of the past have been, because the statistical frequencies are changing. Actuarial statistics looking backward are no longer a guide for the future. If 90 of the world's top insurers see that with such clarity that they self-organize to get a grip on the problem, I think you can have fairly high confidence there's something there worth paying attention to. In the weather space, another interesting trend, and this again will happen globally, but I think you'll see a strong foray of it in the United States, is people are increasingly realizing the value of weather data. One of the major big box retailers has a private company providing them detailed weather every week that is tailored to all 400,000 of their product codes and to every one of their retail locations, and guides their in-store marketing, their product ordering, and their media buys, week by week. So the value of weather data is huge. Airlines, trucking, retail, you name it. And that's generating a lot of interest in different combinations of public and private activity. There are those that would like to monetize the raw data that enables a weather forecast. And they will argue that this will bring private sector innovation and vibrancy to the whole enterprise. And there are those that argue that if you do that, then the data are not a public good on which anybody can innovate and create a new business. They're locked up, and barriers to entry are put into place. And at some point, do you end up with the hazard that you only get a good weather forecast if you had enough money to subscribe to the right service, and the underlying public safety responsibility gets compromised. But stay tuned, because that's humming around the globe in the United States and in the global organizations in Geneva that coordinate all the weather measurements across countries. So that's why I've been having such a blast in just plus or minus the occasional ugly or hard day. That's why I've really had an absolute ball and consider it to be quite a privilege to have been able to serve at NOAA these last 5 years. So, Annalise, with that, let me join you.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you, Kathy, very much. So it's been fun to hear about all the amazing opportunities that have come from the last 5 or so years that you've been in NOAA. But I also wanted to sort of get into a bit of the nitty-gritty and talk just a little bit about some of the greatest leadership challenges that you've also had to face. We got to hear about all the great achievements, but we know that work at NOAA, and because the scope and scale of NOAA is so vast, as you illustrated, that comes with a great assortment of challenges as well. So I think that everybody would enjoy the opportunity to hear what you think of as maybe the top 1 or 2 challenges of the last 5 years that you had to tackle that were meaningful to you.
I think the fundamental challenge of running an agency like NOAA is, I think of it this way: you're running a multifaceted business with a 538-member board of directors called the Congress. And that board, need I say, does not have a unitary idea of what the fundamentals are that you ought to be pursuing. Secondly, people strike me as running for office often as if they're running to be the head of a privately owned company. I will do this, and I will do that, and I will do this. What NOAA does, what it is charged with doing, what it's allowed to do, and a sizable amount of how it's supposed to do it, That's all inscribed in law. And I just told you I have a $6 billion budget. If the Congress appropriated, $100 million there and $10 million there, and I thought that really needs to be 20 and I can afford to take a little out of there, I can't do that on my own. I cannot unilaterally make a change in the budget if it exceeds 10% or $500,000, whichever is the lesser, on a $6 billion budget. So the engagement with the Congress is a very real factor in how you move something forward in any government agency. And what that means is you really have to think ahead, and I think this is the principal role of someone in my seat like the Undersecretary. Where do we need to be going? What is the case statement? What is the rationale? What is the logic that explains why it's important to go there? And you've got to start in training stakeholders, including the Congress, with you. You've got to be clear about what are the 2 to 3 to 5 things that are absolutely indispensable. These are the elements I won't compromise on because they're critical to the how and why. But a lot of the rest of the particulars and details you've got to let other people help own and shape, or you won't be able to bring them along with you. And this is one of the reasons why government moves so slowly, because even if you have the perfectly right idea, you're executing one budget now, one budget's probably under consideration by the Congress at the same time, you're formulating the third year out budget, so you're running 3 budgets at a time, and you've got to persuade the Congress to let this new thing happen. Agencies sometimes are at fault for not moving as swiftly as we as citizens would like them to move, and oftentimes it's because they have to persuade 538 members of their board that this new thing is a good and important thing to do. So it's a fun jigsaw puzzle challenge, and I've always enjoyed storytelling and thinking about the what and the why. And that really becomes what's powerful. And we focused on a very tight set of priorities. During my tenure, we really thought deeply about why are these priorities and how do the pieces and parts of activities relate to those. And we just were really consistent in talking with people and then in living up to and delivering on what we were talking about.
So lots and lots of opportunities for leadership lessons learned with a board of 500 plus. Yes. Many of us who have boards are grateful that we don't have boards of that size.
Yes, you are.
Just put that out there. Not that I have any board members in the audience or anything myself.
We love our board members.
We do love our board members very much. Given that opportunity as it relates to having to navigate, quite frankly, pun fully intended here, having to navigate both the political landscape, the environmental landscape, the policy landscape, the scientific landscape associated with all that NOAA represents. You spoke about the big global issues that we know are headed our way, but more specifically in the short term, if we're looking in that 5 to 10 year horizon, based on the work that has just been completed at NOAA, what is the single most critical issue that NOAA is going to have to tackle right now to enable progress towards those bigger global issues 10, 15, 20 years down the road?
Yeah. I think that there's a big policy hurdle that's going to have to be sorted through over the next couple years, which is, what is the United States policy posture and investment going to be in this thing called climate, and how the Earth itself works. The other big thing that will affect NOAA and NASA and a number of other agencies is the question about how do you sustain the sensors, the measurement networks that are indispensable to having this kind of information. This is never going to be a measure once and some big data problems are once you've got a lot of data, you can just reanalyze statistics and get new answers to different questions. Weather and climate and the natural environment are never going to be that way. You have to continually take the pulse of the planet. It is that dynamic and it's that varied over different scales. So the kind of insight and capability we have today on our smartphone or that big box store I referred to or our airlines, that kind of capability decays and falls away if we don't sustain the measurement flows, the sensor flows. That's a capital investment. NOAA's got about $2 billion in capital investment annually on sensor networks that make the weather forecasting possible, and it's reckoned there's a $20 to $30 million per annum plus private sector enterprise that feeds off of that. Some put it up in the hundreds of millions. So is that a foundational public investment like our federal highway system that enables everything from FedEx to the local baker, or is it a needless expense that we shouldn't operate? We're going to have to deal with some questions like that. Or we could very well find ourselves going blind in terms of environmental intelligence, or losing our sovereign capability to produce environmental intelligence, which has both economic and military dimensions to it.
So some big challenges ahead.
A few,
yes. So just changing gears just a little bit, let's talk about one of the other aspects that we heard today from both from Amy and Carol. Anytime it comes up that Kathy Sullivan is going to be in the room, is a lot of firsts, right? As the first woman who did this, the first woman that did that. One of the big issues that we are talking about a lot in Ohio, locally, nationally, is this whole notion about leadership and getting more women in a variety of fields, in particular, Amy mentioned STEM fields. So, along the way, you've had the opportunity to have a number of significant leadership lessons learned. What, or if any of those specific ones, would you pass on as it relates to that notion of empowering girls and young women as the next generation of leaders? And that will then lead me into that question associated with that, which is really around mentorship. How do we as a community, right, to bring this back to the local Columbus community, how do we as a community work to ensure more opportunities like you've had the opportunity both to share and to lead on our behalf?
An obvious statement, but the younger you can start with any child, helping them know that whatever you're curious about, it's valid to be curious about it. It's valid to explore it. It's not, oh, you look this way, you shouldn't be interested in that, or you're this kind of person, you ought not to care about that. It's knowing that no one gets to edit what you're interested in. If you're interested in it, you get to pursue it. You can go find out how good you are at it or not. Go find out if you just discovered your best hobby, lifelong personal pastime, or you just discovered the thread that will be your greatest career passion. I always, from a very young age, was interested in odd things, in the not typical little girl things. I found the National Geographic maps much more interesting than the Barbie dolls and imagining tea sets. Yes, and worked with a colleague here in town and put a book out aimed at youngsters for just this reason. So helping youngsters, but especially little girls, because in their early teen years, roughly, little girls start to respond to those "you're not supposed to be like this" signals. And you talk to women in this room, you'll find many who said, yeah, I felt that way, but then I kind of realized, and they pulled back. We have to find ways to not incentivize our best talents from pulling back from their very best interests and capabilities, but in fact, enabling them to go forward and develop those talents. One of the things we did at NOAA as part of that is I was a political appointee. There were 18 out of the 20,000 people at NOAA are appointed by the White House. 4 are Senate confirmed, and the rest are just White House appointments, subject matter experts, and things like that. And to maintain good liaison with the career civil servants in our operating units, we would rotate up on about an 18-month rotation. Younger professionals, we call program coordination officers. 30-somethings, the sharp 30-somethings in each business unit. And they would work hand in glove, side by side with the senior political team for 18 months. They'd be in every meeting. They'd go on trips with me. All over the place. They'd be in White House meetings with us. How does the world work? What's that level of executive bearing? How does someone further down the career road than you, how do they handle a sticky situation or the obtrusive person or the awkward? How do they bring the best out of people or spot issues that someone's trying to bear? How do you do those things? And they'd get to see me and the 2 assistant secretaries and our chief scientist and our chief of staff working those sorts of issues. That's fodder for their own development as they go forward, and they would rotate back into their units into the next step of supervisory assignment. So doing that, jump-starting people at a point in their career earlier than tends to be the case. In the field of sciences, there's this age creep going on that I think we see everywhere. When I was in grad school, if you finished your graduate degree in the medical sciences, you probably had your first major grant from, say, National Institutes of Health where you were principal investigator, you probably had that top tier grant in your mid-30s, early mid-30s. You were running a lab with a big grant. That first milestone in those fields is now up in your mid-40s. Yep. So I think all of us can do things to look younger than you think, look the next tier down, look to someone that's ready for a bit of a boost, and find a way, whether it's a rotation or it's an internship or it's a something, that helps them jump a little further, jump a little faster. Be willing to deal with the people at the next tier around that maybe feel reached around a little bit. There'll be some, there'll be maybe some wounded feelings there. But we've got to really find ways to boost young people and let them flex their muscles sooner than sometimes is the case these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And share your story. Right, so that's a great plug for Kathy here, is to share your stories with much younger folks. And so Andy will be letting folks know if you want copies of this next time, you will have them, because Kathy's not allowed really in her previous job to talk about this amazing story that she's done. So she can talk about it just a moment today as part of her next piece of moving forward.
A plug to another Columbusite. Carmela Van Fleet is an independent author here in town that specializes on this age range. And she and I actually began working a frighteningly long time ago on a couple of ideas for books aimed at this kind of market. This came out in January of 16, and as Annalise said, I was not allowed to have any commercial engagement with it, but I'm now 10 days into being allowed to have some commercial.
So perfect. So in a few minutes, we will move to audience questions. So if you can be getting your questions in order, very concise. But let me ask you one final thought before we move to the audience questions, Kathy. The big question that I heard several folks whispering to you as you made your way through the crowd. So what's next for Kathy Sullivan?
Well, I've gotten through the nap phase. I will start what's called a Lindbergh Fellowship at the National Air and Space Museum on March 1st. It's actually Lindbergh Fellowship in Aerospace History. And I proposed to Smithsonian that someone needed to research and write up. There's a short but really quite pivotal chapter of Hubble Telescope history that's gone untold and deserves to be put in the historical record in the proper form, and they happily agreed. So I'll be camping at one or the other of the Air and Space Museums from March through the end of August, working on that. My house up in Worthington Hills has got some renovations underway, so through the course of the summer I think I'll do some progressive cycling move of things back and forth till I'm fully resettled up there sometime in September. And beyond that, lots of people approaching me with different conversations about different opportunities. There's one I'm about to probably make a commitment to in the corporate board arena, and otherwise I'm going to listen and think till probably about September before I make any other big commitments.
So don't call till September.
Oh, you can call. Yeah. We can have coffee, we can have lunch, we can have a nice conversation. Don't bring anything for me to sign.
Very good, very good. So it is a CMC's tradition to take audience questions, as many of you are well aware. And so the way this needs to work is please state your name. Ask your question, please. And we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. I know it's very tempting. But we want to get through as many questions as we possibly can. So let's proceed with the first question, if we could.
Hi, I'm Carol McGuire, and thank you so much, Kathy, for being here today. And we're all excited for your return to Columbus. My stepson, however, who works as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service, is probably lamenting your leaving. I'm glad that you mentioned that you do have some outreach going on in terms of the internal side of things and training meteorologists and others. I have some concerns in a couple of areas. One is certainly the public perception and criticism of the federal government, and yet what you do and what the 20,000 people do in NOAA is critical to all of us. And in the case of how, given that kind of often negative public attitude, how is it that you're able to attract folks to come to work, not only in NOAA, but in other parts? What can we do to help people perceive our federal government as a really great opportunity for people who are trained in so many different ways?
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer. I certainly defend and speak up as a proponent and an advocate of public service. It is still a public good, I believe. I think there is still something very worthy about it and important about it. It's interesting to me that we sort of see such different attitudes, whatever people's political persuasions. I've certainly noticed. You ask them how they feel about the people that are helping make their community run, that's all good. But the further away and more faceless or nameless or anonymous government becomes, the easier it is to just attach every complaint or problem that you have to it. One of the things that always impressed me as I traveled around NOAA land was just both the technical and scientific competency, yes, of the folks that work for us. But you have never seen people of such integrity and passion. They're absolutely so keen to understand the planet, how it works, the environment, and to make that useful to society. That is the one and only full motive. And the data have got to be reliable, true, trustworthy, or they're not actionable and they're not worth responding to. And the pervasiveness of that ethos across all of NOAA is really, really impressive. So I think it's stand up for, push back on folks that just want to tar an entire enterprise with a brush of momentary anger.
Thank you. Next question.
During the last 3 or 4 years at Ohio State, there has been a boot camp for 7th grade girls. It's held at the supercomputer site. I'm sure you're aware of it. Yep. Ms. Sullivan, is there a NOAA look-alike where my granddaughter could go to a NOAA site for a boot camp?
It's not as organized as that across NOAA because NOAA doesn't have as strong an educational mandate in its statutes as it might. NASA has the world's best of all the federal agencies, the best and strongest educational mandate because at its founding, an explicit purpose of NASA was to show the American people they can be confident in the strength of their country, be the bragging rights, and dazzle the United States population in the world with your acumen. NASA's got their own TV channel for crying out loud. But other than NASA and the military, which has some latitude for recruitment, no other government agency really has a strong remit for public education and outreach, a little exception with FEMA. And that's partly that Congress wants agencies talking to the Congress and not making their case directly to the public. So NOAA's got some things, some of the Sea Grant programs, but it's not like a nationwide boot camp kind of thing. It's much more localized. Look around Sea Grant labs, look around national marine sanctuaries, any place there's a major NOAA presence. We have been doing a community day once a year, so probably the Stone Lab and maybe the Cleveland and the Wilmington forecast offices here in state.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, my name is Renee Delane from Women Who Dare, and I wonder 2 questions for you. First of all, if you could sit down and spend the day with anyone, either living or not, who would that be? And the second question was, would you share a little bit about how you explained to your father on a napkin your mission?
The NOAA mission?
Yeah, I think it was a story when I met you and Dr. Glenn at a program, through OSU, and you were telling us something about how he wrote something on a napkin, or you did, to explain how you got up in space or something. Okay, then if you can think of another good story, that'd be great.
and tell some good story. Got that. There's a very long list of people I would be fascinated to meet, but if I had to pick one that comes quickly to mind is, I think I would pick Winston Churchill. And when I say that, I'm thinking of the story of the decision he had to make in 5 very specific days in May of 1940, when Europe was unraveling and his army was almost exterminated, and the British people had no interest in really getting involved in another war. And some of his own ministers were advocating that you just sign an accord with the Nazis and stay out of this mess on the continent. And he knew Britain couldn't possibly win that without the support of the United States of America, and they were asleep on the other side of the pond. And we know now how he decided. He decided against every bit of evidence that was on the radar screen at the time, against everything you could see, hear, or feel, all of which would have told you, just make a deal and get out of this. He decided to fight. Where did he go? What did he turn to? What was it? And by the way, he was not the Winston Churchill we know now. He was basically he was the royal screw-up of British government at that time. He'd done nothing much very right, was not highly regarded even by his own party, much less the other party, and you sort of need people coming with you if you say we're going to go fight these big bad guys. So you don't have a big fan club right now. You're kind of the loser no one quite trusts. You're half an inch better than Neville Chamberlain, but only barely. And you decide you're going to fight. How on God's great earth did you come to that decision? So a historian from Yale has written a book unpacking that moment that I have always found fascinating and that I would give to our young NOAA Corps officers as they were finishing their officer training. But I would love to actually get to sit down with Churchill and talk more about that moment.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Hi, Kathy. Beth Irvin, Experience Columbus. I recently saw the movie Hidden Figures, and it's kind of Hollywood, but I found myself alternating between tears and goosebumps as I watched the astronauts in the early days of the space race, and I watched the way that President Kennedy inspired the nation about, getting to the moon. So I hope you think this is fun. If you were president of the United States, as a former astronaut and someone passionate about our oceans and our planet, what would you do to inspire the nation and bring us together around something much bigger than ourselves?
Well, I think the thing that that was really driving the nation together in the Kennedy era was, of course, the outside threat of the Cold War dynamics with the Soviet Union. But so let me put the lofty and important goal of reunifying the country just slightly to the side, because I have no real clue how to do that. But if I were president or queen for a day or so, what would I do with the space program? I am a proponent of the big, bold, beyond your reach goal as a central raison d'etre for a program like NASA. And for me, that would involve people. And I would have it be people to Mars. And why? Because we don't know right now how to actually achieve that. There's rocket issues, there's radiation issues, there's medical issues, there's monitoring issues, there's food supply issues, there's life support issues that are beyond what we know how to do at the moment. And if you say Mars, back 10 years, go, and don't blink, don't take your foot off the pedal, don't go on and off every 6 months, the solving of those problems would drive so much innovation and acceleration beyond current capability in such a broad array of science, technology, and engineering disciplines that the cascade of benefits that would flow back to life on this Earth in the 10 or 15 years after that had happened would be huge. Telemedicine today, as we know it, you have an accident out in the boonies and your vital signs are being sent while you're being life flighted in. That actually came about from how the hell are we going to know if these guys are having a heart attack on the moon? We got to get something small enough it can go on their body and you can get the telemetry, and it's got to be this small. And so the guys doing the moon part were not asked to revolutionize medicine, but smart emergency medical folks who'd always said, God, if we could know how the patient is doing while they're being transported, we could accelerate the care. Oh, wait, did you see how small they just made that battery? Maybe now we could do that. That's how innovation happens. But someone has to be pushing over the new soil, turning over the fresh bits of soil. So for my money, the challenge of putting humans into something like that and back drives the biggest, richest array, and the benefits, we'd be feeding off those benefits for many decades afterwards.
Great, thank you. So we have time for one more question.
Sure. I'm Kent Thompson. I'm an architect, and I'm wondering if you think the new administration might back us out of the Kyoto Treaty.
Back us out of what?
Kyoto.
We never signed the Kyoto Accords.
Okay. No backing out.
Did you mean the Paris Accord?
Yes.
We shall see. I don't have a crystal ball. That was certainly set on the campaign trail.
Right. Okay. And one simple question. Do you have a favorite weather app?
That's actually a great question. And there's one little, that you might think that NOAA's not dumb people. You might think, well, NOAA will have a NOAA weather app. AccuWeather, the weather company, WeatherBug, they all capitalize. And the dynamic, the public-private dynamic with them, NOAA stops by deliberate decision short of going toe-to-toe and creating apps and vying for your eyeballs, and let them all turn that into commercial opportunity. And nowadays, if NOAA put a toe over the line into doing an app, we hear quickly from one of those guys in particular. Never fails. Weather.gov is what all those guys are starting from. So there are NOAA weather radar apps out there, Weather Radar Pro and things like that. So there are plenty of them out there. It's as much finding one on which you find it easy to set up alerts or warnings or things you want, and to find the localities that are important to you, and then actually to go look at it.
Thank you.
Carol?
Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. We encourage you to continue the conversation with coffee and cookies. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website on YouTube. Please help me thank our sponsors, WCBE and Battelle, our partner, the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and our speakers, Kathryn Sullivan and Annalise Corbin. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you at CMC next week.